Justin, I forgot an announcement.
Oh man, better announce it now.
I said I forgot it.
Oh, well.
No, it was actually the time change this weekend. Yay! The crowd roared with excitement. So spring forward, fall back. So you set your clocks back
Like
an hour Saturday night before you go to bed, and you get an extra hour of sleep supposedly. But that makes up for the hour that you lost in the spring when we set them forward. So if you've been tired since the 1st of March, it's because you lost an hour of sleep, and you'll get it back Saturday night.
Back on schedule, yeah.
You won't be tired again until March. Yeah, it just means I'll wake up, it'll be really dark outside. Anyway, most of your clocks nowadays are automated, and the time change just means now I have to go through the house and find all the clocks that don't automatically reset, and remember to do that.
Well,
what else you got?
The only thing I would think of is, we've got a clock that continuously. We bought it from Walmart, and she continuously is about 15 minutes slow, and it's not very effective at getting places on time.
That's the problem.
And Lindsay just the other day set it to the right time, and then she came home the next day, and it was back 15 minutes again. So there must be a gremlin that comes in and sets our clock back for us 15 minutes. But it's not a cumulative thing. I would think that if it was going bad, there might be a skip or a freeze or whatever that makes it, not continue counting time when the time is passing, and it would just get further and further off. But no, it's 15 minutes, and we've left it, and it's still 15 minutes. So,
well, if it did that
the other way, maybe we'd be on time.
Well, if it did it 15 minutes a day and you just let it go, then after about 48 days, it ought to be at the right time again. So, if my math is right.
Couldn't it be even shorter than that? Or no, 48, because then it'd have to be 96 to go all the way around.
All the way around. Well, if it's
AM,
AM, PM. All right. We digress. Anyways. I think we've lost them already, man.
Anyways.
All right. Where are we at?
Well, to begin all this, Galatians 4:4 says, but when the fullness of time had come.
That's a nice segue.
When the fullness of time, God sent forth the Son, born under woman, born under the law. And Paul gets rambling. Just kidding, he's not rambling. He's teaching very philosophically about the law, and he gets into this idea that there is a Sarah-Hagar demonstration that he would like to make between the two. There is Hagar, which in his metaphor is Mount Sinai, which is like, well, why are you lumping us in with her? We're not the slave woman. We're the chosen people. We're the law. We're the Jews. Why are you putting us with Hagar? And Paul says that's because she is the mother of the flesh, the son that was born of the slave versus the son that was born of the free woman. And so he fleshes all of this out by saying that Isaac is the child of promise and that Ishmael is not. And following the law and law-keeping is basically trying to do what Abraham and, well, I guess it was Sarah, through the surrogate of Hagar, was trying to do. Fulfill God's promises by works of the flesh. And he says that's what law-keeping is doing. It's trying to prove your righteousness by works of the flesh. And so he makes that comparison, that connection, and then he says that Isaac is a child of promise. He was a child of faith, and that is those who live by faith are children from the born of the free woman. And that is the chapter 4 kind of wrap up as it moves us into chapter 5. Verse 31, so brothers, we're not child of the slave, but of the free woman. Chapter 5, verse 1 starts out, for freedom Christ has set us free. Stand therefore and do not submit again to that yoke of slavery. So that was a little bit of our rambling tie-in to Galatians 5.
That is a good setup because we're going to get it to it. So we did kind of right at the bell last week finish up chapter 4. So the chapter 4 wrap up kind of an emphasis on truth and freedom in chapter 4 is kind of the way I saw it. So I tied it into Jesus making the statement, truth will make you free, and that's what Paul is trying to do. He's trying to present the truth to the Galatians in in hopes of setting them free from the false teaching that they have taken off after. So that false teaching was going to lead them into slavery, but Paul was trying to set them free through the truth. And freedom is going to figure heavily into, especially the first part of chapter 5 as we move into that. So, as it does at the end of chapter 4, as he talks about the free woman and the slave woman. So, do you want to wrap anything else up there? Or?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we didn't have enough time to mention last week was works of the law, works of the flesh, and works of righteousness are counted as nothing. And again, follow me with that. I'm not trying to say that you do righteous things, that means nothing, that is nothing. There's not something special about us obeying what God has put forth for us. There's no salvific merit to any of the works of righteousness. But in the plan of God, these things are overlooked by God. And specifically back in this metaphor Paul is using, so if you follow the what is it called? The story, the timeline, the history of Abraham, Hagar, Ishmael, Sarah, and Isaac, who's born first?
Well, Ishmael.
Ishmael's born first. Who is the child of promise?
Isaac.
Isaac. Who is the child that's offered as a sacrifice?
Isaac.
What does God say about Isaac in Genesis 22?
You got me there.
Genesis 22 verse 1 says, after these things God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Verse 2, he said, take your son, your only son. He has two sons, but God doesn't even count Ishmael as a son of Abraham. The works of the flesh, the works that he tried to go and make the promise work, were counted as nothing. We're again, I want to be careful with how I put emphasis on that. But it was just complete. This is your only son. This is the only one that qualifies. The only thing that is going to have any merit, any account. This is the only thing that has status or this ability to call you his father. And so, works of the law, us trying to pave our own way and be righteous on our own, and following the law was completely and irrevocably done away with. This doesn't even mean anything anymore. It's all based on faith. It's all based on the promise. It's all based on this son and becoming a child of this promise. No other way. Yeah,
I like that. I like that tie-in. That is that connection to Genesis 22 is a good one. And it makes sense, especially in light of the argument that Paul is making.
That's such a good point, because Ishmael was not a child of faith. He was their own doing. He was trying to do it.
A child of lack of faith.
Yeah. That's a point I'd never really realized before.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think? Do you think verse 1 of chapter 5 could be considered a key verse? It kind of summarizes the whole thing.
Yes. Yes, we're going to spend some time in verse 1. In fact, as we were jointly working on notes this evening, and I'd see Justin adding stuff, and I'd be adding stuff. It's like, I don't know if we're going to make it past this first verse tonight or not.
Well, a couple times, because it's Google Drive, I like to jump over to Jason's notes and type some random stuff in. See if I can trip them up.
I don't know. Yeah, I didn't type that. So anyway, let's look at, and we've got verses 1 through 6 kind of lumped here together, and that's a big chunk, but we'll take it here, all this section, then we'll break it down.
It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. Behold, I, Paul, say to you that if you receive circumcision, Christ will be of no benefit to you. And I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole law. You have been severed from Christ. You who are seeking to be justified by law, you have fallen from grace. For we, through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything, but faith working through love.
All right, so the first thing is, and this is one of those cases, we talk about it often, it seems like, where whoever the guy was that divided the Bible up into verses and chapters, he gets it right a lot of times, but a lot of times he gets it wrong as well. And because we are so used to it, we're so connected to the text by the way it's divided up, and it's just the way we read it. And so to us, chapter 1 or chapter 5, it's just natural for us to see it as starting a kind of a new idea or a new paragraph or a new whatever. But this really ties back into the verse 1, especially ties back into what Paul just finished saying. It really serves as a conclusion to the whole allegory of Sarah and Hagar. It was for freedom that Christ set us free, and so that freedom is the connection to the things that were being said. So, why this push for freedom? Why this idea that freedom is so important? It was for freedom that Christ set us free, and the structure of that sentence is such that the word freedom is the emphasis. Freedom is. It's weird to have a sentence with the word Christ in it and say Christ isn't the focus of that sentence, but freedom is the focus. How did we get the freedom? It's through Christ, but freedom is what we really are drawn to, our eye is drawn to in that sentence. And so freedom is the focus. Why is that? Well, think about the society that he's writing to. The Galatian churches were in a region it was a Hellenized region. It was a region that was steeped in Greek culture, and it was the Greek culture that had originally, they are the ones that developed freedom. They're the ones that we pattern our free society today, even after things that they did thousands of years ago. They were the ones that before that, societies really didn't think a whole lot about freedom. You had kings, and you had dynasties, and you had kingdoms, and you had people that ruled over you, and there was always a state of flux, and there was always a state of one kingdom taking over another. But the Greeks came along, and especially after Alexander the Great, we would rather die than be slaves. And so anytime somebody challenges our freedom, we go to war, and we fight for that freedom, and we don't back down. Freedom matters. And that's supposed to be, the society even that we live in today. We would have people that say the same thing. And so when Paul is saying your freedom is on the line, he's not speaking, he's drawing upon their culture, he's drawing upon their understanding of what that means to be free. Now he's taking it to a depth that is greater than their physical freedom, that is greater than their subservience to a Roman kingdom or whatever it might be. He's taking it to a spiritual plane, a spiritual level, but it means much more than that. And so, because it means much more than the physical idea of freedom, but he's drawing upon that relationship that they have with freedom to really make his point. And then he, through this idea that we have been set free, Christ set us free for the sake of freedom. That was Christ's intent. That was his purpose in doing what he did. Well, we've got to talk about what that means. What freedom from what? And so he ties it back in at the end of the verse. Do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. Well, what is this yoke of slavery that he speaks of? I think we've got some clues. I think we can tie it to some things. So let's look at these verses that kind of connect this idea. Acts chapter 15. Have we looked at Acts chapter 15 before? What's going on in Acts chapter 15?
A Jerusalem council.
There's a Jerusalem council. We spent time already in this. What are they dealing with at the Jerusalem council? Issues.
How to treat the Gentile believers.
What do we do with Gentiles that are coming into our fellowship? And so what is Galatians dealing with? Galatians is dealing with how do we treat Gentiles that are coming into our fellowship. It covers the same ground. And in Acts chapter 15, do you have that? Go ahead.
Yeah, Acts 15 verse 10 says, "Now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear?"
So here it is, even in the context of that Jerusalem council, as they're talking about what do we do with these Gentile Christians, they call the law itself a yoke that we've not been able to bear. It's something that we have never done well. We've never kept it the way it was supposed to be kept. We've never lived up to the expectations of the law. It's not possible. And so why, if we're bringing in these Gentiles to be a part of our fellowship, why would we place them under a burden that we know from the start they cannot fulfill? Because we've never been able to fulfill it. So what is the yoke of slavery? Well, the yoke of slavery is the law. It's law keeping itself. But is that all that it is? Is the yoke of slavery only this connection to the Mosaic law? Well, I think maybe it goes deeper than that even. So let's look at Romans 8, verse 2.
For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death.
So what is it that we've been set free from through Christ? Yeah, okay, so, but ultimately death, and we'll get there in a minute. We'll go that direction here too, but specifically in Romans chapter 8, what law have we been set free from?
Sin.
The law of sin and death. And so that's not the law of Moses. That's a different law, but it's the natural law. It's the idea of we've got this in Romans chapter 8 that, or Romans chapter 3, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and the wages of sin is death. So we've got this notion that when we sin, we die. Ezekiel chapter 20, I think it is, the soul that sins, it will die. Or maybe 18:20. But it's the law of good versus evil, of right versus wrong. When you sin, you die. It goes all the way back to the garden. What did God tell Adam and Eve in the garden? The day that you eat from the tree, you shall surely die. Okay, that's the law of sin and death. We have been set free from that. How are we set free from it? Through Christ. It was for freedom that Christ set you free. He's setting us free from the law of Moses. He's setting us free from the law of sin and death. Okay, so freedom goes deeper than just the connection to the law of Moses. It goes to the law of sin and death. What about 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 56 and 57?
The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ.
So what have we been set free from? The sting of death is sin, the power of sin, yeah, but we have been given victory. Well, what's victory would be another word for what? Freedom. We've been set free from the sting of sin. And the power of sin is the law. What is the law good for in the book of Hebrews? It's good for pointing out our sins. That's all it's good for. It can't make us righteous. It can't set us free. It can't do us any good. Now, there were good things associated with it. Paul said, I wouldn't have known what covetousness was if the law hadn't told me not to covet. So it was good for teaching us, for instructing us, but it wasn't any good for helping us once we had sinned. It was good for convicting us. It does a really good job of convicting us, but it doesn't set us free. It only enslaves us. And then Romans chapter 6, verses 14 to 18, once again, and this is a few verses longer, but it ties right into what we're talking about.
For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. What then? Are we to sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? By no means. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you're either slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness?
Keep going. 2 more verses.
Oh, okay, my bad. Oh, yeah, 18. But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, having become slaves of righteousness.
All right, so we have been set free from lots of things. We've been set free from the law of Moses. We've been set free from the law of sin and death. We've been set free from the power of sin. We've been set free from the convicting nature of the law. And we have been set free from sin itself. This appeal to freedom that Paul is making is more than just a nationalistic appeal. It's more than just saying, you don't have to obey the law of Moses anymore, cut loose and do those things, go do the things that you never felt like you could do under the law of Moses, because that's all this is about. There's the freedom that's on the line here, the slavery that's on the line here goes far deeper than just the law of Moses. And so we need to make that connection between these things and realize how far Paul is going with this argument that he's making. So is verse 1 a key verse? Yeah. Yep, it's a pretty key verse. It gets to the heart of the matter that freedom is on the line, and it's freedom that we don't want to waste, and we don't want to see taken away from us. Do you have anything to add to that slide, or?
No, I got
Okay.
a different one coming up in just a
You
second.
got an,
after we get-
okay, we're going to get, I get a couple of slides in a row, and this slide, I can already tell you, something went haywire with it, and we're missing some stuff. I hate it when it does that, because it looked great on my computer screen, and then it does this. Thank you. See, it looks great on that screen. All right, so Paul uses circumcision as a focal point, but it's not just about circumcision. It's about a much broader issue than that, and he uses circumcision as we see in other places of the New Testament. The Jews themselves are called the party of the circumcision, and Gentiles referred to as uncircumcision. It wasn't that was the only thing that set Jews apart from Gentiles. There were lots of things that set Jews apart from Gentiles, but that's the one that was used as kind of a focal point, and Paul is using it here in this section as a focal point as well, and he makes quite a few issues out of this one focal point. First of all, circumcision was the entry point into the Old Covenant. I mean, it was a defining characteristic. Okay, there were other societies who worshiped gods and worshiped deities. They did, they had a lot of things. They offered sacrifices. They did things that in many ways would have looked similar to what the Jews did, but then there was circumcision, and that was different. And it was an entry point into the law. We see that, in lots of different stories through the Old Testament. We see it when Moses had been in the wilderness, and he had married, and then as they're going back to Egypt, and his wife actually has to circumcise the boys because Moses hadn't done that, and it was going to be an issue as they go back, right? We see it with the sons of Israel who used circumcision as a tool to subdue a town where their sister had been mistreated. But they used the argument that if you want to be a part of our fellowship, this is the thing that has to happen. And so circumcision was that focal point of being an entry into that old covenant relationship with God. And so if that's what it gets you, if it gets you into that old covenant, that's not where we want to be. We don't want to be a part of that old covenant. Christ came to establish a new covenant. And he's made that case throughout that Christ came to establish something different. And so we don't want an entry point into the old covenant. We want an entry point into the new covenant. And so, we're not going in, we don't want to go in through the wrong door here. And so we need to change our focus. He makes the case that accepting circumcision was a rejection of Christ. He says it outright. That in verse 2, if you receive circumcision, Christ will be of no benefit to you. And so you have a choice to make. You can choose an entry point into an old covenant that doesn't get you where you want to be, or you can choose an entry point into a new covenant, but those aren't the same thing, and if you choose one, you can't have the other. And so you can't take both. Tim?
What really matters is why are you getting this? Why are you going down that road?
Yeah.
It's really, that's the heart of it.
For sure.
If you're doing it because you think that's going to somehow, by keeping it all of a sudden now you are.
Right.
It's for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
It's not what they did, it's why they did it.
I think you're exactly right. And it's not an issue with the medical procedure that Paul is taking issue with. He's taking issue with the intent behind what that procedure does for you. And so if you're doing it as a matter of righteousness, which we've talked about already, if you're doing it as a matter of saying, this will make me righteous, nope, it won't. It can't. That's never what it was for. That's never what it was intended for. That was never the purpose of it. And so it can't make you righteous, and if you're thinking that it can, then you're wrong. So Paul testifies to this position. He uses that word in verse 3, and he emphasizes it. He says it. He makes his case in verse 2, and then in verse 3, and he says, and I testify again. So he's making it, and then he basically uses an oath, which you would use as an emphatic statement. The word there, martyromai, is I'm saying that right? That's the word where we get what word? Martyr.
Martyr.
Yeah. What does a martyr do? They die for what they believe in. They stand up to the point of death. Paul is using that word that we use. He's saying, I make my stand on this argument. I take my stand on this case. I will become a martyr if necessary for this cause. I am solemnly affirming, I am solemnly declaring that this is the truth. And so he is not going to waver on this. He's making his case on it. He makes the case that circumcision is of no benefit unless kept with the whole law. If you're going to make circumcision the entry point into the covenant, you got to keep the whole covenant. You can't just pick and choose. It was part of an entire system, and you can't take one part of it and not take the whole part. So Paul makes that case. He makes the case next that he says justification by law is tantamount, is equal to, is having fallen from grace. In verse 4, you who are seeking to be justified by law, you have fallen from grace. That which they had accepted by the Spirit through faith, they are rejecting, they are giving up, they are laying it aside if they choose to now seek to be justified by law. You can't have it both ways. You can't have an entry point into the old law and an entry point into the new law and try to go both directions at once. It doesn't work. Johnny.
Hard to read that and not understand that you can fall from grace.
Well, I mean, I don't know how else he would say it if that's not what he meant. And so the idea of falling from grace, you have to be in grace to fall from it. He makes the statement in a couple of verses. Let's see, you are, or same verse, I'm sorry, at the beginning of the verse, you have been severed from Christ. You're seeking to be justified by the law. In order to be severed from something, you had to be attached to it. And if you're not attached to it, you can't be severed from it. And so I agree. I mean, it seems to be a clear statement to me that there was a relationship there that has been severed because of the deeds that they had undertaken, which was seeking to be justified by faith, or seeking to be justified by law after they had been justified by faith. And then finally, the one that you can't see on my screen, or this screen that I can see on his screen, is that he kind of concludes it by saying circumcision is nothing and faith is everything. He's like circumcision and uncircumcision. In the end, what it boils down to, it's irrelevant. And those who are trying to make an issue out of it are making an issue out of nothing. It's not even a mountain out of a molehill because it's not even a molehill. It's like it's no issue. There's nothing to it. And we can't make anything out of something that God never intended for anything to be there. So circumcision is nothing. Faith is everything. That's what it comes down to. And so we've got to keep our eyes on faith. Greg.
Can we take a minute and try to make this passage mean something to us today?
Okay.
There's not a whole lot of us that are trying to follow the old law today.
Sure.
So how do we make this relate to being saved by grace today?
Okay. So I think the application there for us would be that to kind of go back to that idea of back to verse 1. So back to verse 1, it was for freedom that Christ set us free in that yoke of slavery. Within the context, it would be really easy to make that case that the yoke of slavery is their adherence to the law of Moses. That's the yoke of slavery. But it goes much deeper than that. It goes back to the law of sin and death. It goes back to sin, other aspects and other ways in which we've been set free. And so there are applications for us to make as we read through the rest of the chapter that you're right. The law of Moses, I'm not tempted, to give up the freedom that I have in Christ to go back and adhere to daily sacrifices and temple worship and those kind of things. I'm of no desire to do any of those things, and so Galatians chapter 5 has nothing for me, right? Well, no, because there are other things that I can put in place of that law, that I can put in place of those things, and so I think I can give you an example. Maybe this will work as an example. Many years ago, I I don't know if this is going to be a good example or not, but I'm going to do it anyway because now I'm focused on it. Many years ago, we were on our way to Sunday evening worship service, and as we drove past a place where we saw one of our church members who was obviously not going to be at Sunday evening church services that night because they were doing a service project, building a handicap ramp for a loved one. And I can remember in that moment thinking, I guess they're skipping church tonight. But maybe, instead of thinking that, maybe I should have stopped and helped build the ramp for the person that needed the help. And so where was my heart, where was my thought in that moment, but thinking we're justified by coming here to check a box that we're supposed to be at church on a Sunday night, instead of, here we're going to get to it a few verses later, what is the royal law, what is the most important thing? To love your neighbor as yourself and to serve others. And so, that's a convicting thing for me to talk about, but what was I focused on? I don't think I was focused, I think I was focused on an outward display that I valued. I value being at church. I'm not trying to tell anybody to skip church, by the way. But there are other things at play as well. Tim?
Driving legalism.
I think so.
And
I think we always have to be on guard against that because again, it goes to, is it Luke 18 with the Pharisee and the publican or the Pharisee and the tax collector who were at prayer in the temple? And, I thank God that I'm not like him, and I tithe, I fast, here's all the great things that I do for you, God. And remember, what is our righteousness before God? Filthy rags. The best thing that I can do and present it to God as a work of righteousness, God's like, I wouldn't even wipe my feet on that because that's filthy. And then there was the sinner that was in the courtyard saying, have mercy on me, a sinner. And so legalism, I think, is a real application for us and a real danger for us, and not just us, but I think Christianity as a whole in the wider world.
Legalism means you're doing it for the wrong reason.
Right.
Doing
it as an act of righteousness.
It's an act of righteousness instead of an act of love.
Or an act of faith, yeah.
We're asked to love the Lord our God with all our soul, all our heart, and all our mind. The neighbor is ourselves. And so those things that you do in worship and those things you do are acts of love. But if they are done out of a checklist, or we can create a law in and of ourselves,
right,
that again is not looking at grace.
I think you just made me think of a passage. Well, you made, I'm going several different directions at once, but Colossians, Colossians chapter 2 talks about those who would set up things, verse 16, let no one act as your judge in regard to food or drink in respect to festival or new moon or Sabbath day, things which are mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement, the worship of angels, taking a stand on visions he has seen inflated without cause by his fleshly mind, not holding fast to the head, from whom the entire body being supplied and held together by the joints and ligaments grows with a growth which is from God. So there's a distinction between those things which are spiritual and those things which are fleshly. And he says later, verse 23, these are matters which have to be sure the appearance of wisdom and self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. He's not saying give in to fleshly indulgence, but he's saying there are things that people will prescribe or will say you must do this in order to keep from indulging the flesh, but there's no biblical, there's no scriptural or biblical imperative to do those things or to forbid those things or to abstain from those things. And so, they sound good because if I can tell you, you can't eat you can't eat on these certain days, and that's going to make you focus more on prayer, but I'm telling you, you can't eat on those days. And that's the way I'm going to make you focus on prayer. Well, then that might sound good, but I don't have the authority to do that. And if we focus on the not eating so that we focus on prayer, that's not biblical either. I mean, fasting is biblical, but it prescribing it or mandating it is not.
That's like Romans 14. Verse 17, the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating or drinking, but of righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit, because anyone who serves God in this way is pleasing to God and approved by men. Then down in verse 22, so whatever you believe about these things, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the man who does not condemn himself by what he approves.
Yeah.
It comes down to why is the way narrow that leads to life? It might relate to the fact that putting God first means not having one foot in each camp. And the Israelites, or the Christians that came out of Judaism, were trying to keep a foot in each camp. Mm-hmm. We can do that today too, as we take on Christ, and we have things that we like that take us away from our first love, keeping a foot in the world, and keeping an idea that we're going to follow Christ and keep a foot in the world too. Doesn't work.
That's James chapter 4. Friendship with the world is enmity with God. And he calls those that would do such adulteresses. The idea of so much in James applies. James chapter 2, show me your faith without your works, and I by my works will show you my faith. So the idea of faithful obedience is righteous, but obedience to procure righteousness is a keeping of the law that gets you nowhere. And so it's that becomes legalism. And so everything is predicated on faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For those who would come to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who seek him. We still have to seek him. We still have to follow him. We still have to obey him. But we do so on the basis of faith, not on the basis of seeking to be made or declared righteous by the things that we do. And it seems like a splitting of hairs. To those who stand outside of our fellowship would come into this right now and think, those people are nuts. But for us, it's a matter of eternal salvation. It's a matter of not getting the cart before the horse and understanding where our relationship with God is found. Don?
As children, when we follow what our parents say, I think I did anyways, because I respected my parents. I loved my parents because I wanted them to be happy and do the things that they expected of me. So with that being said, that's us as Christians. We should want to do those things to make God happy. Mm-hmm. It's not that he's forcing us to do it, but because we respect and hold him in reverence, that we want to do the things that please right. God.
Yeah.
And that's where that freedom is. We have a choice. We can either do sin or not. But he's given us the choice to do that.
You're right. I mean, it's a delicate balance. As we've studied the Holy Spirit this year, we've talked several times. I think we talked about it maybe in our circle group a time or two, and maybe in some other settings as well, that it's interesting to think that from the perspective of even as we're getting into Galatians chapter 5 here, when he starts talking about works of the Spirit, to work side by side with somebody who is not a believer, they have no adherence to Christianity, they have no desire to know God or to think anything about God, and yet we might stand shoulder to shoulder with somebody in a community service project, and they do it out of a sense of wanting to help their community or help or whatever. We do it out of a sense of wanting to love our neighbor as we've been instructed to do. And so for us, it's a matter of faith, and it's an expression of our faith, and God counts that as righteousness because it's an expression of our faith. But for that person who declares no faith, God does not recognize that action as an act of righteousness. And so what was it that Abraham did that God declared as righteous? Well, it was his faith. But would God have counted him righteous if he had sat at home and not gone and offered Isaac? No. It was his faith that led him to go do it, but he had to go do it in order to be counted as righteous. And so it was because of his faith that he was counted righteous, but only through a faith that was expressed in obedience. And so for us to say, well, all that matters is faith, that's all that matters, faith, and so I don't have to obey, well, good luck with that. That's not going to get you anywhere. And for the other end of the spectrum that says, well, all that we have to do is obey, and even I don't declare it as faith, I'm just going to obey, well, good luck with that too, because that's not going to get you anywhere. And it's got to be a measured melding of those two things, that it is obedience predicated on faith that is what God wants from us. Johnny.
Well, we can see legalism in a way out there, and there's some obvious things that you think about. I mean, I'm thinking about some ritual that was in the Philippines that I read about, where once a year they literally walk down the streets and beat themselves raw on their backs to show their love for Jesus. And that was something they felt they had to do every year. We can look at that and say, obviously, man, that's just out there. That's wrong. And we got to stay away from that. But we got to realize that there's two ditches. There's one on both sides of the road. And we can get to the other side where we don't think we need to do anything because we don't want to be legalistic about something. Yeah. And we've fallen in the ditch on the other side.
Yeah. I think Paul addresses that, the very thing that we're talking about, when he says things like in Romans, he says it in Romans. I mean, let's just be honest. Romans 6:1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may increase? That's the opposite end of legalism. We don't want to be so legalistic that we, like the Jews had a law for everything, and everything broke the law. I mean, you couldn't do this because it broke that law. So if you tried not to break this law, you ended up breaking that law. I mean, everything broke a law, and that's legalism. But the other end of that is like there is no law. We've got grace, and so we're just going to do whatever we want to do, and there is no obedience. There's nothing but a declaration of faith. That's all there is. And so that's the other end of that spectrum, and neither one of those are okay. We need to not get caught up in either side of that argument. We want to stay in the middle of that narrow road and not get off into either ditch. And Justin's preaching on the Sermon on the Mount on Sunday nights, and he's going to get to that passage, and you just hear him come hear him talk about that when he gets to it.
When I get there, yeah.
Do you have anything you want to add to this? I've kind of been taking over here.
Well, I realize now why I sprinkle my wisdoms in instead of having a slide after.
Did I even get all my slide taken care of? I think I did.
I think so.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So this was a slide that I made, and we basically talked about all of it thus far. So we might probably just continue on through. But one of the things I wanted to highlight from this passage were that, he's talking about circumcision, and we've already discussed it a lot. I mean, it's not that, well, if you're circumcised, well, then Jesus means nothing to you, because that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about accepting the fact that I need to be righteous by performing the acts of the law. And we've talked about that and discussed that's not good. And he talks about how circumcision, if you're, it's of no advantage to you, Christ is. If you accept circumcision as your way of relating to God, is through this through this circumcismic, I don't know, I don't like that word.
Circumcision.
Yeah, but like the way in which you relate to God, if it's based on circumcision, based on this idea that we can, check all the boxes, jump through the hoops, do the right things, Christ has no meaning. And then he says you are severed from Christ. We talked about that, but again, it's the words are the ESV tries to do that very well, and I think the NASB does it too, but it's a wordplay there. I mean, it's you wanted to be circumcised, and yet what you ended up cutting off was Christ. And the thing that we've already talked about that continues there was you who would be justified by the law have fallen from grace. And we already talked about a little bit of that, but the way you fall from grace is by making grace mean nothing. I think sometimes we think, well, if you're fallen from grace, are those out there that are just living immorally. And Paul will get in that. He says, verse 16 to the end of the chapter, the works of the flesh, those that do these things. Verse 21, I warn you as I warned you before that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. And so, yes, that's something we want to look out for, that we're not, falling from grace looks like someone that has turned their back on Christ, that has devoted themselves to the flesh. But what Paul is talking about when he brings up this idea you are falling from grace is that you have replaced grace with another way of relating to God. You've replaced grace with this idea that I can make it, that I can do it, that I've got enough checked on the boxes. And what I think is Greg, one of his questions from earlier was how can we make this relevant? And the thing that I brought up a couple weeks ago was that legalism, at least the way that it appears to me in my life and in the lives of those that I see living in legalism, it shows up in insecurity of knowing, well, have I checked enough of the boxes? If you miss church, is there this intense desire? Well, I'm not walking down the road beating my back like the Philip, I'm not partaking in the rituals. Or an insecurity, a fear of, oh man, I've missed it one time, and then I'm never right in the eyes of God anymore because I've made this one mistake, and my status has been changed and altered because the way I relate to God was how well I'm doing, not what Jesus has done for me. And finally, it comes through criticism, and I think that's something that we all fall into at different times of, well, I've been following it better than you. I've been checking the boxes better. My church attendance is better. And I think that we might get into it a little bit next week if we, I don't know how much further we'll make it tonight, but one of the slides that I had coming up next talks about how this idea that genuine faith, genuine trust is about serving others. Genuine faith is about serving others. Genuine faith that is real, genuine trust in God, a genuine walk with Him is not about how righteous we can become and how many of the boxes we can check and how many times we show up at church and how many things that we do for God. True righteousness is about serving others. And if you want to look at acts of righteousness, even while we're Christians, if we look at the good things that we try to do and we're doing them because we think that we're fulfilling the law or fulfilling what Christ has called us to do, we've still got our crosshairs slightly off. It's about serving others. It's about loving others. As he'll just get into, the whole law is fulfilled in one word, love your neighbor as yourself. The whole purpose of these righteous things are to love others, not to make it about you and how righteous you are. And sometimes I think, well, man, I made it to church. It's about how righteous I am because I made it here. I studied my Bible because it's how righteous I was. And the focus is on how I am bettering, improving, and making myself better. Johnny.
Greg and I talk all the time about trying to get people to understand what they miss when they are not here. Leslie and I missed Sunday because we were doing one of those things Jason was talking about of going and serving someone else. But we missed being here. We missed the fellowship. We missed the worship. We missed you guys. We missed being here. And we're trying to get more people to understand that they should miss being here. Not because, well, you missed church. No, you missed what you could get out of by being here.
Well, I think, the way I would sort of, tie in, I think what you're saying is it's not about, well, I need to check the box, I need to come here and make sure that everyone isn't disappointed with me because I missed church or for some reason, but it's about the heart of I want to show up and I want to love people, and yes, there's a great benefit that comes from that, and by loving God through worship and through fellowship and loving others, I think that there's a great opportunity here when we do make it to church, but it's not about the insecurity of, well, man, I guess I better go to church today because people are going to be disappointed, or the fear that it's going to come crashing down and people aren't going to think that I'm a good Christian, or things, but truly living from a heart of love that wants to work together. And I think at least a little bit of it for me comes to head in verse 5. For through the Spirit by faith we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. But what is the hope of righteousness?
Hope is probably the worst translated word in all the Bible. Because what we picture as hope, it's an assurance. I think assurance would be much better than I've ever used the word hope. Because hope implies, well, it may not happen. Well, that's not how I operate. It's not the promise of Jesus. It's an assurance.
I think it's one of the words that has become the most watered down through. I mean, we could pick other words too. Love has become a watered down word because we use it. Yeah, I love ice cream, but I also love my wife and I love Jesus. So those aren't all the same thing, you know. Yeah, and hope, you know, hope. Yeah, I hope for salvation. I also hope the Chiefs win the Super Bowl this year. Those aren't the same thing. So you're right, and so hope is. I appreciate that point, that hope, it's biblical hope. It's New Testament hope. That's what he's talking about. So what is the hope of righteousness? Go ahead. John.
When Greg ended up saying earlier that not really focusing on trying to do the old law, have no interest in trying to go that path. And maybe the world is where you put your foot in that becomes kind of that situation. My thought ended up being that yoke of slavery also has, I don't think of myself as a slave. I don't think of myself, I think I'm free. But as this conversation went, I'm realizing, no, the world is completely a matter of slavery, because basically my years in school were, with children especially, if you wore the wrong tennis shoes, you know, if you didn't wear the right clothes, if you didn't have your hair right, you didn't fit in, and it was stressful. It was horrible for kids. And for adults, it's not much different. We try to fit in. We want to end up, there's so many tiny things that really become gigantic as far as day-to-day life, where you're not really free. You really are trying to end up being tied into something that's not important, insignificant, doesn't matter. But in our lives, in the world, we make it out to be very important at times.
Yeah, I think you're right, and the tie-in here for that is none of those things have to do with righteousness. I mean, those things, and so when we spend our time worrying about those things or investing in those things or even finding hope in those things, maybe if I do the right thing or say the right thing or wear the right thing today, I'll be more accepted. Well, I'm placing hope, which isn't hope in something that can't buy me a future. And so the hope of righteousness is what, righteousness exalts a nation, and righteousness is our relationship with God. God made him who had no sin to become sin on our behalf so that we might have the righteousness of God. So righteousness is what will sustain us. Righteousness is what will give us a future. And placing our hope in that is mandatory, but it's not a righteousness that we gain for ourselves through adherence to the law. It's the righteousness that God bestows upon us through faith. How was Abraham counted as righteous? Through faith, and a faith that led him to obey. Yeah, and that was before the law. That predated the law. Where were you going with that?
Well,
or do we need to wait till next week?
In 10 words or less. When I took this was
Let's set our clocks back an hour right now.
Yeah. was sanctification.
Okay.
The hope of righteousness. I made that word more of the content of the hope of they're talking about how you've got to. You're falling away from grace because you're justified by the law. You're doing all of these. You're trying to do all these things to justify yourself. But I think verse 5 means, for through the Spirit, walking by the Spirit, being led by the Spirit, by our faith, because that's how we are engaging with Him, we ourselves are waiting for the hope of righteousness, the hope that comes when the Spirit has led us through the sanctification process. We are conformed to the image of His Son day by day, and we are continuously transforming our minds and living as an imitator of Christ. And I think that's the hope of righteousness, is that it's a progression
It's transformative.
that we engage in. So anyways, appreciate it. See you next week.
All right.